Today, in my series about floats, I want to talk about stick floats. They're a float that have been around for over 70 years, sometime in the 1950s, when Benny Ashurst, who came from Leigh in Lancashire, was fishing on the canals quite a lot. He fished before the Second World War and after the war. He was looking to make a delicate float that he could cast across the local canal, and at that time I suspect a lot of the old Lancashire and Manchester cotton mills were derelict or suffering from some sort of recession, and amongst the debris there would have been spindles made of a hardwood, possibly Lignum vitae, very dense wood, possibly another dense wood, and these spindles probably had some sort of taper, and he took some of these spindles and worked them and spigoted them into a small balsa top, a slim bit of balsa dowel, and he had a float that sort of semi self-cocked. So it's sort of, when you cast it in, it cocks slowly, with fairly simple shotting patterns, often a BB underneath it and just one shot down the line. Could cast across the canal with a caster, and he was developing the use of casters instead of just maggots turned into chrysalis. He saw that if you riddled them off as they turned, you could, and looked after them, you could have all sinkers, so they would feed these across the canal. Not sure if it was with a catapult or a throwing stick, and it opened up a technique of fishing for them to fish across the canal. There were no long poles in those days. I don't think anyone pole fished at all in Lancashire back in the 1950s. And the old style of canal fishing then was very much under your rod tip. They'd fish a centre pin reel, very fine lines, tiny little float, probably a crow quill dotted down, something like that, and very close in. So he's fishing across 9-10 yards maybe across to the far bank, and it's a waiting game. So he might have fished close in early on, firing just a few casters over, and then the last couple of hours, when the roach had time to settle, he'd go over and get a few roach. And these were, for the canals, quality fish. They might be 2, 3, 4, 5 ounces, and you might not need, the winning weights were often £1 or £2, and 3, 4 roach on top of some small little tiny roach and gudgeon and things early on would be enough to win. And there it might have remained, but anglers from Lancashire were keen to spread their wings, and they started to travel to the Trent, which was a long drive from there. I don't know how far it is without looking it up, but you're probably talking a good 3 hours each way, 2.5, 3 hours each way. The cars were a lot slower and less reliable. And the Trent back then, on the big match lengths, which were really from Stoke Ferry down through to sort of Gunthorpe and then Caythorpe, around Newark, Holme Marsh. They didn't fish on the tidal so much, and they didn't fish the upper Trent in those days, which was very, very polluted. And on the Trent, there were a whole load of big coal-fired power stations. And these power stations during the week would put warm water into the Trent. And the Trent was quite, although it was very polluted on the upper Trent, especially where the River Tame came in from Birmingham, it had a fair bit of colour in it, there was a lot of sewage going into it. Often had foam from soap suds before they took the foaming agents out of washing powders, and there were virtually no chub. I doubt if there were any barbel, but small roach and gudgeon proliferated. Occasionally there were places where there was some dace, a few bleak. That was about it. Anything else was pretty rare. And these roach were doing well. And because of the warmth of the water, even in the winter, the river on a cold day would be steaming. There'd be steam coming off the river. Blimey. And the traditional way of fishing the Trent for the locals, the Nottingham anglers, was to fish with a centre pin. Bear in mind we're talking built cane rods. They may well have been Spanish reed with a finer tip, or a built cane rod. The traditional sort of Trent rod was only about 10 and a half foot long, maybe 11 foot. Hollow fiberglass was starting to come in right at the end of the 50s and the early 60s. It made progress then. And they would fish with a centre pin, and they would fish with floats that were things like porcupine quills, taking sort of 4 or 5 BB, and they fishing with maggots, fishing fairly close in and putting it through, slowing it down with a bit of weight on it, maybe overshotting it and getting catches of roach and gudgeon. One of the big names from back then was Jim Sharp, who was said to be a very natty dresser and a very, very neat angler, very successful back then. And Benny went there with his up-and-coming match angler son, Kevin, and other anglers from around Manchester and Leigh. And they looked at this fishing on there and they thought, I wonder if we could fish with casters and use our stick floats, we could catch on the drop. So instead of a big shot and a little shot, they took floats that took about 2 BB, a little bit bigger stick floats, and then they strung out number 4s and 6s, and they varied it a bit around there, and there was this balance of the stick float. So they'd cast out, and instead of sitting bolt upright like the balsas with the bolt going straight down, they'd watch it going down, and they were fishing what they called casting reels back in those days, which would have been a Mitchell 300, the standard Mitchell. The Mitchell match had yet to really emerge. There were the automatic, the 330, that was around, but I don't know if they were using it. But they were fishing light lines and casters on the drop with a stick float. Things evolved from there. People made bigger sticks. Other anglers from elsewhere started to cotton on. The Nottingham anglers, there were sort of centre pin versus fixed spool battles on the Trent, and the Nottingham anglers would be fishing their centre pins and the heavier floats, and the Manchester anglers would fish their stick floats with casters. And gradually casters sort of took over on the Trent. Anglers like Ivan Marks from Leicester, famously, Benny saw Ivan on the banks practicing and said, "You've got to learn the caster method." Took all Ivan's maggots away and gave him half a gallon of casters and said, "You're going to have to you're going to have to fish with casters." And Ivan cracked it, and it went from there. And at that time, commercially available sticks were non-existent, and then they started to turn up a little bit. I think there was a Big Shot Watson's, I think it was in Nottingham, started to bring out some stick floats with cane and balsa, and that most of us think of a dense cane, often like these green garden canes, which you can still buy. This is a brand new one, bought quite recently. One thing I'm not totally sure about this cane is whether if you bake it, whether it will get dry out a little bit and shrink and become a bit denser, a bit harder. This one's quite flexible, surprisingly flexible. I don't know. This is an old Ivan Mark stick. This is made of cane, and if you were to take that paint off, you'd still find some of the green dye, and yet this cane there's no flex at all in it. It really is rock hard, and you can't, in the famous words of Eric Morecambe, you can't see the join. Well, you can because I've painted it badly, but there is a join there, and this quite heavy cane, which is similar to this thickness there, is spigoted in. So a spigot is where you take the sort of 4mm diameter there, 4.5mm, and cut round carefully, and then you end up with a bit that's say 2.5mm thick, and then you just need a 2.5mm hole into the bit of balsa dowel, and then you glue it together. Basic principle of making a stick float, a very important one. And then the tips vary quite a bit. Ivan Marks like tips like this. This has got a fairly fine conical tip. Other anglers, as time went on, Nottingham and the area grew its own experts. A guy called Pete Warren, very, very successful in the early 70s. All I've got to do is find one of his floats now. I've got boxes of floats here. There we go. Pete Warren, 6 No. 4. This was painted all black, but you can see the cane underneath. This is thinner than the float Ivan had, and it's got a rounded tip. As time went on into the 70s, some of the power stations started to close down, and the influx of warm water became more spasmodic, and sometimes instead of all this on the drop fishing from the mid 60s, it became much more trotting through at full depth. Pete Warren's style was still on the casters, but fairly close in, under very tight control. The float would be dotted, often slightly overshotted, not very far out, and he could fish. All the other methods don't. He's still around. Like I say, his match record at one Christmas, I think it was 71 into 72 or something like that. He was virtually not out of the frame in huge matches, weekend after weekend, midweek matches, the lot. It's match after match after match, first, seconds, thirds or fourths occasionally, but incredibly successful. He really was in the groove, getting the reasonable pegs. So this pattern survives today. It's not that hard to make. It's fairly bulbous towards the tip, and then it slims down and then goes down to about a 3.5mm cane that then fines down to about 2mm. These floats were made by the tens of thousands. They're still around. You might have to look on eBay or car boot sales and things, or you can make your own. Very good floats, worth looking out for. In the mid 1970s, a new name started to appear. He was fishing a bit more on the Nene and the Witham at first, and then there was a Division 2 national on the Trent in 1975, and his name cropped up, possibly one of the first times anyone had heard of him. And that name was to strike fear into almost a generation of Nottingham anglers. John Dean, he came fourth in that national. By 1981, he'd been Matchman of the Year at least once, if not twice. Incredible record, like Pete Warren before him. By then, people would switch to fishing bronze maggots a great deal on the Trent. And what he made his stick floats, and this is a commercial one. It's quite a big one, 8 number 4. That's about the biggest. There are wire stem ones and there are alloy stem ones. They're quite rare. Paint's coming off this one. Yeah, can come off. His floats have, you can bend it a bit there, and the paint will come off some more. They have moulded plastic stems. The thing about plastic, it's got that, you can get whatever density you want according to the plastic you use. Originally, people were using what John Dean was using and others. They were buying children's paintbrushes, which by the late 70s had tapered plastic stems, and you get different brands. These are incredibly cheap. I don't know what these cost. They're made in China nowadays. They're probably made in England back then. You get different plastics, different tapers. Even nowadays you can get them for a packet for £1 or £2, and you're getting, I don't know, these even in there, 12 in there. Sometimes you get 10, sometimes you get 8. So they're only 10 or 20 pence each. You can use the brush if you use it as a brush for making your floats if you like, and you cut off however much plastic you want, get the taper you want, and again you need to shape a spigot out of this plastic. Plastic's harder to make a spigot than in cane. It can be done, but lots of people have made what they call paintbrush sticks. The Dave Thomas sticks, which came in the 80s as well, also had plastic stems. Pete Drennan made, and probably still does make, floats with plastic stems. The density varies a bit. He did some clear ones that were quite, to my mind, they're a bit too heavy. So stick float, if you don't have enough weight, it doesn't really cast well, sit right. If you have too much weight, it can be too much of a good thing, and it sort of goes vertical too quickly. So think about that. I've got an awful lot of stick floats I've made over the years. These are commercial ones, that how I carry them in these boxes. There's a lot of John Dean's. There's some Ultra Lignum sticks in there. They are extremely sought after. They cast beautifully. The balance on these is perfect. I've almost got a complete set of those. Very hard to find those anywhere, but lovely floats. 6 number 4. If you want to cast a long way, if you can find the genuine Ultra Lignums, then they are worth it. So that one there with a bright green base, that's a paintbrush one that I made, slimmer than the ones I showed you in the packet. Horrible stuff to work to do a spigot, but I got there in the end. You just need patience and the right tools, very sharp tools. This one's a little cane stem one made from that garden cane. It's got a green, see the green on it. That cane had been in my dad's greenhouse about 10 years, and it sort of dried out and got very dense. I think there's a process there somewhere for getting it right. This little float, I don't know if you can see, it's bright green near the bottom. That's a little bit of fiberglass in that one. And if you get like broken quiver tips, which has tapers and all the rest of it, and you get the right amount, you can make a lovely little float. This float attempts to copy a float I had in the late 80s and early 90s. I made it with fiberglass. It was a one-off, little float like this. Took, I think, 6 number 8s and 2 number 10s, and you just strung the shot out. You could cast it 25 yards on a fine line, maximum of £2, like £1.50. Daiwa floating line, Daiwa Harrier line. Phenomenal float. Unfortunately, in the end, I hit a big chub. The line broke above the float. The chub fell off the hook, and I just watched the float disappear down the river on the Bristol Avon, never to be seen again. Headed somewhere for the Bristol Channel, which was a sad shame. Somewhere in here, and I can't see them, I've also made floats from solid carbon fibre. That is quite heavy stuff, quite easy to work. You can put it into a drill and work away with it. That's your basic stick floats with a heavier base. There was another name coming to the fore in the 1970s, and he won an enormous number of matches. Nowadays, I think he mostly fishes still waters. I believe he's still winning. He's won a colossal number of matches. I mean, colossal. And his name is John Allerton. Don't need much of an introduction. He introduced floats with a bit of a shoulder and using alloy, I think it's a sort of welding rod, about 1.5 millimeters thick. And this is an Allerton one. The original ones are like a dark navy blue. And they're very good. They've been much copied by different people. This is a Drennan one, totally different shape, no shoulder on it, just more of a bulbous body on it. And nowadays people like Dave Harrell makes whole ranges of floats with alloy stems, and it's not too hard to get hold of this alloy. Somewhere in this pile there's some alloy. Yes, there we are. There's some alloy there. It's fairly good stuff, fairly springy, and you can make your own alloy stem floats. I think with floats, I'm going to wrap it up there for stick floats. I think with stick floats, it's a question of experimenting, making different variants and finding which ones work. When they work, you know they work. When they don't, they just don't sit right, they don't fish right, they come out of the water when you're trying to hold them back, and stuff like that. But I may do a second one on stick floats. It's a huge subject. I've been going on for nearly half an hour now, which is plenty long enough. I'll probably do a part 2 for this one and see where that takes us. Until then, it's goodbye for now.